What I find so interesting about the China Dissent Monitor is that I think there's this sort of popular perception that, there was a big protest in Tiananmen Square massacre, and then ever since then, there's been no protests because people are too afraid or brainwashed to protest. But, from the evidence that you're showing, that there's actually a large degree of protests still happening in China.
Yeah, this is one of the main motivations of this project, among others, was an information gap that has led to a number of misconceptions, and one of them being this one, that protest is actually very rare, that people in China, they don't dare organize or use sort of non-institutional means to try to bring attention to injustices around them, that they only walk the line and go through designated routes and channels. And, for sort of a passive observer, you can't blame people for this because the information is just not out there. It's very difficult to collect. It takes really a systematic approach to collect it in any sort of scale. And the one-party state makes it intentionally difficult to find. So part of the purpose of censorship is not just to censor direct criticism, so online dissent. It's also to censor evidence of things that are happening offline. So protest is anything that has to do with sort of collective actions, particularly if it's sort of a pattern, is targeted for censorship. And there's clear efforts based on keywords or even video analysis to try to prevent video and picture analysis to prevent these things from being circulated widely online. Despite that, you're still able to find some of this evidence if you know how to look for it and if you do it relatively quickly in some cases and you back it up. You're able to find it, but it's not easy to do. And going back to your question, the average person is not just going to be able to find this stuff being shared widely. And also because we're talking about something, it's a matter of sort of statistics, frequency. When you see one video of a protest, you might still perceive it as rare. But when you put those things together into a database, it's only then that you realize that it's not that rare, that you have multiple protests happening every day that we can find direct evidence of. It's definitely something that we were trying to respond to with this project, was filling in that information gap. And I just want to add to that another, even though you didn't ask about it directly, another misconception that we're also trying to respond to is the idea, sort of linked to the first one, that there's sometimes some cultural, sort of like this cultural stereotype that there's something about Chinese culture that, unfortunately, this is out there. There's something about Chinese culture that leads to the perception that Chinese people, just listen to the authority in a particular case, whether it's the party or whoever the authority is in a particular circumstance. And this is something that I think people who are close observers of China always knew not to be true, but it's still out there. There's still this sort of generalization made by certain people who are sometimes quite influential. So this is another thing that we wanted to push back against through direct evidence, is that actually in small ways and large ways, people in China do dissent quite regularly, and they don't have that sort of limitation.
Kind of related is looking through your database, you see a lot of single person protests. And I think there is this also perception of Chinese people that like, oh, well, they care more about the collective good than like individualism.
Like
yeah. So that, nobody would stick their neck out for something because like they care more about like the collective. That's why the society is like that.
Right. Yeah, there was something like 5% of the cases that we found are some sort of solo protest or one-person protest. This gets back to what you had mentioned before, Shelley, about the risk. particularly if you're not in a group, the risk of a solo protest is very high. So that it's not extremely rare, it's somewhat common that you have these sorts of protests is notable, that people are willing to take the risk of putting themselves out there by themselves. I think within the context, it's quite notable. That said, if you're a person who has had an injustice sort of come upon you or your community, it is safer. You do mitigate risks somewhat by doing it in a group, even in the context of a very repressive regime, political regime. So I think that's why, it's one of the reasons why we probably see collective action is much more common, at least in the numbers that we found, than sort of individual protests. Because within the context of, that you're probably going to meet some sort of resistance or potential reprisal from authorities, if you're doing a public action, doing it in a group mitigates that risk a little bit.
Well, speaking of one-person protests, there was a sort of one that became very well known ahead of the party Congress in October, where one guy, it seems like it was one guy, hung a couple banners on this bridge in Beijing, basically calling for freedom and calling for an end to Xi Jinping. And that ended up getting quite a lot of attention, and it was sort of unusual in that way. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, I think that the form of that protest and some of the substance of it was less unusual than the reporting suggested. But some of the other content of it, like explicitly opposing Xi Jinping's rule or the way that he governs, is much more rare. That, as I mentioned before, sort of protest against central government or central figures is more rare. But there were other things that it seemed, based on what we could tell from the protest, motivated that person, like COVID restrictions and the ongoing restrictions and how they impact people's lives. That's something that, as we've already talked about, is not that rare, and we're seeing it across the country. Another thing that was somewhat common is the form of protest that he used. It seemed to be a man that he used. Was a banner, right? He hung a banner across the highway, and we see these sorts of banners being used not only by people holding them up in a march or in a demonstration, but we also see them hung on buildings or in other public places to try to express some sort of dissent, including about COVID restrictions, but also a lot of other issues. So I think that protest did deserve the attention that it got because of the timing and what I mean. It was a rare protest in the sense that it was directed at Xi Jinping to some extent. But when we put it into the context of everything else that we've found, there's a lot that we see there that has crossover with other types of protests in China.